She is a liability, Councilman Veyrath said, and he said it the way men like him said all difficult things, quietly, with the reasonable tone of someone simply reciting fact. She has no bloodline to speak of, no political alliance, no leverage we can use. Every day she remains in this court, she presents a vulnerability we cannot afford. Naira stood in the corridor outside the council chamber, one hand resting flat against the cold stone wall, and she did not move. She had come to deliver the evening's inventory ledger, the one that should have gone to the steward's table 2 floors up, but had been handed to her instead, because the page who usually ran it had taken ill, and such tasks had a way of finding her, tasks that belonged to no one in particular, and so had fallen to her. She had not intended to overhear. She simply had not been seen, which was, she supposed, the usual condition. She listened to the rest of it, all of it. Veyrath went on for another several minutes, his voice never rising, and the 2 other council members present offered their quiet agreement in the way of men who have already decided and are only waiting for permission to say so. The word liability appeared 4 more times, she counted. There was also risk and also unnecessary, and, once, a phrase that translated, in the formal court language they had switched to briefly, to something very close to the wrong kind of woman, in the wrong kind of place. She did not allow herself to feel it yet. That was something she had learned early and had been practicing ever since, the postponement of feeling, the careful setting aside of injury until she was somewhere that she could afford it. She simply recorded what she heard, the way she recorded everything, accurately and without embellishment. When the voices moved toward the far end of the chamber, in the direction of the door on the opposite side, she straightened and stepped back and walked the long way around to the steward's table, delivered the ledger, and received a nod that landed somewhere in the region of her left ear. She said nothing. She walked back to the small room on the east corridor that had been hers for the past 11 months, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and placed both hands in her lap and looked at the far wall. It was stone. It had always been stone. There was a small window above the writing desk that let in whatever weather happened to be passing, and tonight it was passing cold, a deep winter cold that had settled over the keep for the last 3 weeks and showed no particular interest in leaving. She could hear the wind moving through the courtyard below, a low, uneven sound, like something restless and without resolution. She thought about what Veyrath had said. She thought about it with the same method she applied to everything, not looking away from it, not softening it, not translating it into something easier. He had called her a liability. He had said it with certainty and without cruelty, which was, in its way, the more accurate verdict. Cruelty implied she had mattered enough to wound deliberately. She had not. She let that settle. Then she got up, lit the small lamp on her desk, and opened the record she was working on. There was still 2 hours of work left in the evening, and the work, at least, was hers. She had come to the Ironmere Court 11 months ago, from the Northern Holding, where she had spent the first 23 years of her life, doing work that was useful and unacknowledged in equal measure. Her designation was Omega. It was, in the social mathematics of the court, the least advantageous thing she could be, and she had known this since she was old enough to understand that the way a room rearranged itself when she entered had a name and a logic, even if no one in that room would have bothered to explain it to her. Omegas occupied the lower rungs by biological signal alone, which meant that competence was treated as a pleasant accident rather than a credential, and that her work was regularly absorbed into the records of others without comment, the way water disappears into stone. She had a post in the court's archival division, which was the division that no one competed for, and which suited her precisely because no one competed for it. Her task was the maintenance and cross-referencing of the court's long records, the territorial accounts, the treaty histories, the genealogical registers that stretched back 4 and 5 centuries. And she was good at it, in the way a person is good at a thing, when they have been doing it carefully and without recognition for long enough, that excellence has simply become habit. She found errors that other recorders had made and corrected them without ceremony. She located documents that had been misfiled and returned them to their proper sequence. She built indexes that the senior archivists used without knowing who had made them. Her name was Naira. No one in the Ironmere court used it very often. She had a small economy of necessities that marked her station clearly if you knew what to look for. The archivist's robe she wore was slightly too large, a cast-off from someone who had held the post before her, and the right cuff had been re-stitched twice, with thread that was a shade darker than the original. Her boots were serviceable and no longer than that, the left sole reinforced at the toe with a small piece of leather she had fitted herself when the seam split in the autumn's first frost. She kept her dark hair braided back and pinned close to her head, not from vanity, but from the practical understanding that loose hair caught on archive shelves, and there was no one to notice whether she was attractive or not. These were not complaints. She had not framed them as complaints, even to herself. They were simply the coordinates of her existence, the measurements by which she navigated. She worked in the archive room from the 6th bell to the late evening most days, and occasionally passed it when a particular record required the kind of sustained concentration that was easier to maintain after the building had gone quiet. She liked the quiet of it. She liked the specific order of things on shelves, the weight of a well-preserved ledger, the way a good index made a century feel navigable. She had made peace, in the way of someone who has been practicing for a long time, with the fact that this was likely to be the shape of her life, useful, careful, invisible. The morning after Veyrath's council meeting, she rose at the 5th bell the same as always, washed her face in the basin of water that was always cold, plaited her hair, and went to the archive. On the 3rd day of the new year, during the deepest part of the winter cold, when the stones of the keep were so thoroughly chilled that the lamp flames in the archive corridors barely wavered for lack of any warmth to feed on, Naira pulled a bound genealogical register from the upper shelf of the east wall, and something happened that had not happened before and could not, by any logic she applied to it, have been happening now. The record glowed. It was a quiet light, faint and amber warm, and it came from within the binding itself rather than from any external source, and it lasted perhaps 4 seconds before it faded and left behind nothing but the ordinary, worn leather cover of a document that was, by her calculation, approximately 260 years old. She stood with it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened it. The pages were as they always were, dry, cream-colored, inscribed in the precise archival hand of whatever recorder had kept this particular register, the names and dates arranged in their proper hierarchical columns. Nothing glowed, nothing moved. The record was simply itself. She replaced it on the shelf and went back to her table and sat down. She wrote in her own daily record, in the small, careful notation she used for unexplained observations: East Register, Upper Shelf, 4th volume, 3rd day of the new year, faint luminescence, amber, approximately 4 seconds, cause unknown. And then she continued with her work, because the alternative was to have no work, and that was the worst thing. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell who would have received it as anything other than evidence that the Omega archivist was, in addition to everything else, unreliable. It happened again, on the 7th day, and then on the 9th. Each time, the same register. Each time, the same amber warmth, and each time lasting a fraction longer than the time before. On the 9th occurrence, she held the record open and watched it happen, watched the ink glow as though the words were briefly lit from beneath, and she observed the particular lines it illuminated, which were, she noted with the careful, unembarrassed attention she gave to all anomalies, the lines of a specific genealogical chain, the direct succession of the Ironmere throne. That was when she understood this had moved beyond a personal curiosity. She did not tell anyone about this discovery either, but she began, with the methodical patience that was her primary professional attribute, to cross-reference every record in her care that touched the same genealogical line, and to build, page by careful page, a picture of what the glowing register was actually pointing to. She was on her 9th day of this secondary project when she first became aware of being watched. It was not the watched feeling that came from Veyrath and his kind, the assessing look that measured and discarded simultaneously. This was different. This had weight and stillness to it, the quality of attention paid by someone who was deciding, rather than simply observing. She noticed it first as a peripheral awareness on a morning when she had been working for 3 hours straight without looking up, and when she finally did look up, the doorway at the far end of the archive corridor was empty. But the air in the corridor was not the same as it had been before. It carried something, cedarwood and cold iron, and something deeper underneath that she could not name and did not try to, only registered and set aside in the same way she set all useful data aside for later examination. She looked at the empty doorway for one moment, then she looked back at her work. The next day she arrived at the archive before the 6th bell, which was earlier than usual, because she had woken before dawn with the particular restlessness that came when she was in the middle of a problem that hadn't resolved yet, and she had not been able to lie in the narrow bed, pretending the restlessness wasn't there. She lit the lamp, set her materials out in their order, and sat down. He was already in the corridor. She knew who he was. Everyone in the Ironmere court knew who he was. Stellan, king of the Ironmere territory and everything that bordered it on 3 sides, and he was standing in the corridor outside the archive room with his hands clasped behind his back and his attention fixed, with an exactness that was not casual, on the shelf where the glowing register lived. She had not heard him arrive. He moved with the particular silence of someone who has spent a very long time moving without being followed. He was taller than the accounts of him suggested, and broader across the shoulders, and he wore no crown and no formal state clothing, only the dark, practical garments of someone who had dressed to be somewhere without announcement. His hair was dark, silver at the temples, and his face in the lamplight was composed and unhurried, in a way that she recognized as belonging to someone who had been composed for so long that the composure had become structural rather than performed. He turned his head toward her with a deliberateness that indicated he had known she was there before he turned. "You work early," he said. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation delivered in the same matter-of-fact register she recognized from her own interior monologue, and she found that she was not afraid, which was interesting because she was very nearly everything else, uncertain, alert, and acutely aware of the 4 feet of archive corridor between them, and the way that the scent she had noted yesterday was significantly stronger now, cedar and iron, and something warm underneath that pressed against her like a hand against a door. "The records don't adjust to the bells," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the territory adjacent to it. "I know," he said. He came twice more that week, always in the early hours, before the court woke properly. Both times he stood where she worked and watched without speaking very much, and both times she continued working, because stopping would have required an explanation she did not have, and because the work itself was, she found, easier when he was in the room. She did not examine that too closely. On the 3rd visit, he sat across the table from her. Not close, across. "Tell me what you think it means," he said, and nodded toward the register. She looked up from the cross-reference she was building. She considered, briefly, performing uncertainty, the reflexive downplaying that was the Omega Archivist's natural register in a room with a king. Then she decided against it, because he had not sat across from her in a corridor at the 5th bell to receive a performance. "It illuminates the same chain of succession every time," she said. "The direct bloodline of the Ironmere throne, 3 generations from a point approximately 240 years ago. There are 3 names in the illuminated sequence that do not appear in the public register, but are present in the sealed genealogical accounts in the lower archive, accounts that have not been opened, by the access records I can see, in over a century. She paused. I think the record is pointing to something that was deliberately removed from the public line. He was very still. And what do you think was removed? I think someone was written out, she said, and I think the record disagrees. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She met his eyes and did not look away, because she had learned that looking away was interpreted as confirmation of whatever story the room had already decided about you, and she was no longer interested in confirming stories that were not accurate. How long have you been working on this? He said, 9 days for the cross-reference, 11 months for the broader archive. No one told you to. No, she agreed. No one told me to. He stood then, and she noticed, not cruelty in it, but preference, that he did not do it quickly. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision before he arrived. At the door he paused, and did not turn back. Don't go anywhere, he said. She looked at the empty doorway after he had left it. The archive was quiet. The lamp on the table between them had burned lower while they spoke, and the room was a fraction dimmer for it, and she was aware of the warmth that lingered in the air where he had been sitting, cedarwood, and iron, and that other thing she still had not named, and she was aware that her shoulder, the left one, was aching faintly with no cause she could explain. She picked up her pen and continued the cross-reference. The work was still there. The work was always still there. What she did not know then, and would not know for some time, was that Stellan had been aware of the archive anomaly for 6 days before he found her. His own chamberlain had brought him word of a glowing record in the lower east corridor, a report he had received with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned to receive unusual information without displaying how it lands in him. He had come to the archive himself in the earliest hours of the morning, before anyone else arrived, and he had stood in front of the register on the upper shelf, and it had not glowed for him. It had only glowed, as he confirmed on each of the next 3 visits, when Naira was in the room. He had known, with the certainty that bypassed reason and arrived in the body first, what that meant. He had known it the way his wolf had known it before he did, a single, silent sentence in the back of his mind that he had not permitted himself to repeat aloud. Mine. He had crushed it immediately and entirely, and then he had returned the next morning and stood in her corridor and watched her work, and crushed it again, and each time it cost him something he could not account for in any ledger he had ever kept. He had not had a bond in over 200 years. The last one had ended in the 31st year of his reign, when Marin had died in the winter of the contested succession, and he had held the grief of it so long it had calcified into something he had simply stopped calling grief and started calling himself. He had made no claims since. He had told himself, in the reasonable language of a man who had survived long enough to be reasonable about everything, that it would not happen again, and he had believed it, because the alternative, to hope and have it end again, was a cost he had not been able to calculate. But the record glowed, only for Naira. His wolf knew why, and now, sitting in his own chambers after the morning's archive visit, he held that knowledge in both hands, like a document he had not yet decided how to file. Councilman Veyrath came to Stellan's council chamber 3 days after the king's last archive visit, and he came prepared. He set a formal summary document on the table between them, 8 pages, and he summarized its contents in the measured tones of someone performing a civic duty. The Omega Archivist, Veyrath began, the one currently in the Lower East Corridor Division. Naira, Stellan said. His voice was level. A fractional pause. Yes, we have been reviewing her placement. There are concerns regarding the access she has been granted to the sealed genealogical accounts, which fall under restricted territory classification. She has no clearance for those materials, and there is a reasonable argument that her handling of them constitutes a breach of archival protocol. He smoothed the document on the table. Furthermore, her presence in the lower East Wing has been noted as irregular in terms of hours and access patterns. The Council's recommendation is a formal review, with suspension of archive access pending a determination of whether her appointment was made through the proper channels. Veyrath's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had composed his argument carefully and was delivering it correctly. He was not lying, precisely. The procedural points he raised were real procedural points, technically defensible. He was using the machinery of institution with the fluency of someone who had operated it for a long time and knew exactly where the handles were. He was also doing it, Stellan understood, because he had noticed the king's visits to the archive and had performed the calculation that came naturally to a man who managed power through information. This was not cruelty. It was self-interest, wearing the correct institutional clothing, and Veyrath was very good at the fit. "The sealed accounts," Stellan said. "Do you know what she found in them? The specific contents of her work are less relevant than the protocol breach." "And yet," Stellan said, "I am asking about the contents." Veyrath's expression did not change. He was very practiced. "She claims to have identified a genealogical discrepancy." "She has," Stellan said. "She identified it correctly, documented it thoroughly, and cross-referenced it against 3 independent source records, with no duplication errors. I have reviewed the work." He paused. "The genealogical discrepancy she found concerns a name that was removed from the public succession register in the 240th year of the Ironmere line. That removal was made by formal council action, not royal action. I believe you are aware of that history." The quiet that followed was a specific quality of quiet. It was not empty. "A formal review is still warranted," Veyrath said, after a moment. "The protocol breach remains." "Yes," Stellan agreed. "It does. Which is why I authorized her access to the sealed accounts retroactively this morning, before this meeting." He looked at Veyrath with the measured attention he applied to all difficult things. "The authorization is now documented and filed. If the review proceeds, it will proceed against a record that shows full clearance at the time of her access. I would recommend the Council consider whether that is the review they want to have." Veyrath said nothing. "I appreciate your diligence," Stellan said, and meant it in the way a man means something accurate rather than kind. "That will be all." Naira received word of the retroactive authorization that same afternoon through the archival office's formal notification system, a small slip of paper delivered to her desk by a junior clerk who placed it beside her lamp and retreated without comment. She read it twice. She held it between her fingers for a moment and looked at the window above the desk, which was letting in the particular grey light of a winter afternoon, flat and clean and without warmth. She had not asked him to do it. She had not asked him for anything. She had built her case with what she had and had been prepared to present it on its own merits to whatever review the Council convened, because that was the method she applied. Evidence over petition, documentation over appeal. He had done it without being asked. Not to rescue her, she thought. He was not the kind of man who rescued as a category of activity. He had done it because it was accurate, because the authorization was warranted, and the record was wrong without it, and he had simply corrected the record. She recognized the reasoning, because it was hers. She placed the slip of paper in the folder with her other documentation, smoothed it flat, and returned to the cross-reference. An hour before the archive was scheduled to close for the evening, he came. Not the early morning this time, not the unmarked pre-dawn visit of a man who wanted no witnesses. He came in the late afternoon when the archive was still technically open, when 2 junior clerks were completing their filing in the adjacent room, when anyone who happened to walk past the east corridor might have seen him standing in the archivist's doorway. Naira looked up from the document she was completing. "The council meeting," she said. "It was not a question. Veyrath will not pursue it," he said, because of the authorization. Because the authorization makes the procedural argument hollow, and Veyrath is intelligent enough to know when a position is not worth holding. He paused. You knew there would be a challenge. I expected one, yes. He came a step further into the room. Not close. He kept the table between them, as he always did, but the step itself was different from the doorway, more declared. Why didn't you come to me? It wasn't your problem to solve, she said. The record was sufficient. I had documented everything correctly. She looked at him directly. If the review had gone forward, I would have presented the evidence. The evidence was complete. I know it was complete. I read it. Something moved across his face, not quite the expression she would have named, but not far from it. I authorized the access because it was warranted, not because you needed protection. I know, she said. I want that to be clear. It is. A pause. The archive was very quiet. The lamp between them had burned down to a steady low flame. The record, he said, and for the first time since she had known him, she heard something in his voice that was not quite composed, something underneath the structure of it, pressing upward. It doesn't glow for anyone else. You know that. She had suspected. She had not allowed herself to know it. I thought it might be something in the documents themselves. I stood in front of it for 3 mornings before you arrived, he said. Nothing. The moment you walked in, he stopped. He looked at the shelf where the register sat in its place on the upper row. The Ironmere succession records have been glowing since the 17th day of the first month. Every time the true heir's bloodline is in proximity to those documents. He turned back to her. That is what it means. That is what the record has always meant. There is precedent. Aldrich of the 8th Council period has documentation of the same phenomenon, same register, same amber light, in the hand of a witness who was in the room when it happened, because the person who triggered it was standing in the archive. She was very still. You're telling me I'm in the succession line. Not in it, he said. You are the line, Naira, the name that was removed from the public register 240 years ago, the name you found. That removal didn't erase the bloodline, it only erased the record. He was watching her with an attention that had nothing casual in it, nothing performed. You carry it. The archive has been telling me since the 17th day. I have been deciding what to do with what it told me. She sat with that for a moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was unusual. She was aware of the faint ache in her left shoulder, which had not gone away since the first morning she had spent in this room with him, which she now understood was not a coincidence, and had probably never been a coincidence. You should have told me sooner, she said. Not accusation, accuracy. Yes, he said. I should have. He did not move. He stood on the other side of the table, with his hands at his sides, and she could see what it cost him, the stillness of it, the jaw tight, and the hands open, and the deliberate space he was maintaining between himself and everything he was not saying yet, not doing yet. She looked at him for a long time. I overheard Veyrath, she said, 3 weeks ago, in the corridor outside the council chamber. He called me a liability. I know. You knew then too. Yes. And you let the meeting happen. I let Veyrath make his argument, he said, because he had the right to make it, and because stopping him before he spoke would have created a different problem. And then I ended it. His voice was very even. I did not let anything happen to you, Naira. I want to be precise about that. She believed him. She believed him not because he was the king, and she was inclined toward deference. She was not, particularly, but because he was precise in the way she recognized, and precision, in her experience, was its own form of honesty. What do you want? She asked. He took a breath, slow, deliberate. The hands at his sides closed briefly and opened again. I want to ask you to stay, he said, not because the succession record requires it, not because the bond makes a case for it, that I don't have to make myself, because I am asking. Because I am choosing to ask. He held her gaze. I have been making decisions for 200 years based on what I could not afford to want. I would like to stop doing that. She was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, she said. It was not a refusal. He heard that, and something in his face settled. A very small change, not relief, but the anticipation of it. That's fair, he said. She did not rush the thinking. She was not built for rushing, and he did not press her. That itself said something. The winter broke in the 3rd week of the 2nd month. Not dramatically, but in the way seasons ended in the north, gradually and without announcement, the cold withdrawing by increments, the stone of the keep releasing its long-held chill, the morning light arriving a little earlier each day and lasting a little longer. The corridors smelled different when the cold left, less iron, more earth, something like possibility. She took 3 weeks to think. In that time she went to see the oldest keeper of the court's sealed archive, a woman named Hedra, who had been maintaining the lower records for longer than Naira had been alive, and who, when Naira presented her findings about the removed genealogical name, spread the documents on the table between them and looked at the evidence for a long time with the expression of someone recognizing a face they thought they would never see again. I knew there was a removal, Hedra said. There is always a removal in every succession history, somewhere. An heir made inconvenient, a name made to disappear. I never knew which name. She touched the edge of the document gently. Your work is correct. This is meticulous. Thank you, Naira said. He found you then, Hedra said. Not a question. The record found me first, Naira said. Hedra made a sound that was the closest thing to approval Naira had heard, from someone she respected. That's the better story. Remember to tell it that way. She told Stellan her answer on a morning in the early 3rd month, when the light through the archive window was new and pale, and the cold had become something bearable, rather than something to survive. Yes, she said, when he appeared in the doorway in the pre-dawn dark, as he had appeared so many mornings, and she said it before he could say anything else, because she had thought carefully, and she knew her own mind, and she did not see any value in delay beyond what the thinking had required. He looked at her for a moment, then he came fully into the room. Not because of the record, she said. I know. Not because of the succession line. I know that too. Because you came back every morning, she said. And you sat across the table, and you did not perform anything. And when it mattered, you were precise. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she was serious about, steadily, without flinching. That is a sufficient basis. He came to stand beside her at the table, not across from her this time, not the careful maintained distance, but beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, cedar and iron, and the thing beneath it that she had stopped trying not to name. Don't go anywhere, he said. The words were quiet and familiar now, and meant more than they had the first time he had said them. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The spring settled in slowly, the way the right things do, without spectacle and without rush, and with the quiet permanence of a thing that has found its place. The archive on the east corridor remained Naira's, because she was the best person for it, and because she preferred it, and the work she had always done continued. The index she had built the previous winter became the standard reference for the sealed succession records, and it bore her name in the official notation, which it had always deserved and had never had. The succession record she had uncovered, the removed genealogical name and its consequences, was formally restored to the public register in the 4th month, by council action, unanimous, in the end, because Stellan had presented the evidence with the same plain, documented precision she had used to find it, and the council had not had anywhere to put their objections. Veyrath voted with the rest. He said nothing, which was accurate rather than kind, and she held no particular feeling about it. The record had been wrong. Now it was correct. That was the thing that mattered. She still wore the archivist's robe that was slightly too large. There was no reason, she thought, to replace a thing that was still doing its job. On a morning in the early summer, when the light came through the archive window at an angle that turned the dust in the air to gold, Stellan brought 2 cups of something warm and set one beside her work without comment, the way he had begun doing on the mornings he had no other demands on the early hours. She looked at it, and then at him, and he sat across from her at the table. Across, today, the familiar distance, and opened the morning's correspondence, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them was the specific, comfortable silence of 2 people who have no need to fill it. The amber register sat on the upper shelf of the east wall, where it always had, in its proper place in the sequence. If it still glowed, she could not have said for certain, because she was no longer looking for the phenomenon. She already knew what it had been pointing to. It was not remarkable. It was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything. Would you have stayed in that archive, quiet and unseen, long enough to find out what the record was pointing to? Let me know in the comments below. She had come to understand, over the weeks that followed, that the court itself was a kind of record, layered and imperfect, and full of corrections made over time by hands that were sometimes careful and sometimes not. She had been reading it since she arrived, and now she was reading it differently, not as someone passing through a system that had no place for her, but as someone who knew where she was in the index. The junior clerks in the archival division had noticed the change before she had, which was perhaps fitting. They had always been polite in the careful way of people who were uncertain what category she occupied, and now they were polite in a different way, less careful and more genuine, the way people are when the uncertainty resolves. A young woman named Sefa, who handled the incoming territorial correspondence, had begun leaving small notes beside the documents she delivered to Naira's desk. Brief, useful annotations in a clear hand, flagging dates or cross-references she thought might be relevant. The first time Naira found one, she looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrote a brief note in return, thanking Sefa for the observation and adding 2 additional cross-references of her own. They had been passing notes through the document flow ever since, an informal professional correspondence that had become, without either of them deciding it, something Naira looked forward to. This was the shape of belonging, she thought, not ceremony, not declaration, small daily evidence, accumulated. Hedra came by the East Corridor Archive once a week now, in the mid-morning when the light was good, and they worked in companionable quiet together on the broader restoration project, because the removed genealogical line had proved to be only the most visible of several deliberate omissions in the sealed records, and the full accounting of what had been altered, and when, and by whose instruction, was a project that would take longer than either of them alone could manage. Hedra brought dried fruit from somewhere in the keep's stores and placed it on the corner of the table without comment, and Naira ate it without comment, and they worked. "You're different," Hedra said one morning, without looking up from the document she was annotating. "The same amount of work," Naira said. "Yes," Hedra said, "but you are not holding yourself as if you are waiting for someone to ask you to leave." Naira considered this. She looked at the document in her own hands, the careful columns of names and dates that were slowly, correctly, being made whole again. "I suppose I have stopped expecting that." "Good," Hedra said simply, and that was the end of it. Stellan told her, one morning when they were both in the archive and the early light had not yet given way to the full business of the day, that Vyrath had requested a reassignment to the Northern Territorial Office, a position of genuine authority and some distance from the Central Court. He had made the request himself, through the proper channels, and Stellan had granted it. "He wasn't wrong about everything," Naira said. Stellan looked at her. "He was accurate about my lack of bloodline alliance and political leverage," she said. "At the time, She turned a page. He simply drew the wrong conclusion from accurate observations. Stellan was quiet for a moment. "You are being generous." "I'm being precise," she said. "There is a difference." He made a sound that was low and brief, and occupied, she was beginning to learn, the territory of what other people would have called a laugh. The bond between them had not announced itself with force, or with any particular drama. It had deepened the way the light was deepening now, through the archive window, incrementally, 1 degree at a time, until the change was undeniable, without being traceable to a single moment. She felt it in the way the room felt different when he entered it, not only warm, but complete, the way a record feels when the last cross-reference resolves and the index finally holds. And as she felt it in the left shoulder that had ached since winter, which no longer ached, which had, somewhere in the 3rd month without her noting the exact morning, simply stopped hurting, the way a pain stops when the thing that caused it is no longer absent. He had mentioned it once, plainly and without pressure, and she had said she was not ready, and he had said, equally plainly, that there was no urgency in the thing that did not leave. And there wasn't. The bond held without ceremony. The mark could wait for the moment she chose it, and not a moment before. That was the kind of man he was. She had suspected it early. By summer she was certain. On an afternoon in the 6th month, when the keep's interior had finally warmed enough that she left the archive window open during the working day, she found him standing at the upper shelf in the east corridor, looking at the amber register. He had his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she recognized from the first morning she had seen him in this corridor, and he was looking at the register with an expression she could read now, careful and fond, and a little careful in its fondness. "It hasn't glowed in weeks," she said from the doorway. "I know." He did not turn. "I think it has finished its argument." She crossed the room and stood beside him. The register sat where it always sat, ordinary in the afternoon light, its worn leather cover giving away nothing. She looked at it for a moment, this document that was 260 years old and had been waiting, apparently, for someone to stand in the right room and be the right person, and she thought that there was something almost companionable about that kind of patience, the long faithfulness of a record that knew what it knew and had simply continued being accurate until someone arrived to confirm it. "Aldrich's witness account," she said, "the one you mentioned. Where is it held?" "Lower East Wing, 3rd shelf, sealed under the 7th Council classification. I'd like to read it." "I know," he said, and reached into his coat and produced a small folded authorization. He had written it before he came. Of course he had. She took it from him without comment and felt the specific warmth that was not embarrassment and not surprise, but something she had stopped having a name for because it simply lived in her now, constant and without condition. She placed the authorization in her document folder, smoothed it flat, and looked at the register once more. Then she turned back to her table and her work, and he sat across from her in the particular quiet of the morning, and the summer light came through the open window and lay across the archive in wide, warm bands that moved slowly along the shelves as the sun moved, touching the spines of records that were now, finally, correctly indexed. It was not remarkable. It was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything,